Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Welcome to another episode of Weird Web Radio. I am your host, Lonnie Scott. This month we're going to be doing a little something new. I'm giving a big shout out to all of my Patreon supporters and members, and I want to give an extra special shout out to Heather Whalen and Lucano Molina for being part of the membership at the level of which you get this very shout out. And if you want to hear your name on this show, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. You can be a guest. If you're so inclined, you can send me an email at weirdwebradio@gmail.com, or you can become a Patreon supporter and go to the levels of which you get to hear your name on the show. Thank you to all of those who help make this show possible. Once again, I was bitten by a bad audio bug. I'm trying to work this out with the podcast recording provider that I use, who shall not be blamed for this. They usually provide a wonderful service that's Zencastr, in case you're curious. And you can go to their website and check out all the different plans that are available if you're curious about starting the show yourself. I recorded a series of interviews over January and February, and this is the final one of those. And unfortunately, I didn't discover any problems until I got into the post-production. So again, I cleaned it up as best I could, but you're going to notice, especially if you're a regular listener, that I don't quite sound like myself in this show. And I apologize for that. I'm hoping that I have solved that problem for all future episodes, but we'll deal with it as it comes. The most important part of this is that the guest isn't bitten by the bug themselves. And in this show, the guest is the one and only Christopher Penczak. When I was coming up into my own form of paganism and the occult, well over 20 years ago now, names like Raymond Buckland and Scott Cunningham were synonymous with witchcraft when you went to the bookstore. Now, there are other authors out there, and one name comes up again and again and again and again when you start asking people, where should they go to begin learning witchcraft? Where should you send your kids when they start getting interested to start learning about witchcraft? And one of those most consistent names that pops up is Christopher's. So I just want to say it was a really cool chance to have him on the show. He was awesome to talk to. He was a very gracious guest, and I really hope you enjoy what we cover. I did want to mention something, that there's a part in the show where we're talking about popular things on TV, different things in media. I made some comment about a new Buffy episode or show, and what I meant to talk about was the New Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix. So other than that minor error, I'm pretty sure I didn't make any other little silly gaffes. From Christopher's bio, he is a modern witch working in the Temple of Witchcraft tradition and community that he helped co-found. His practice focuses on the intersection of love, will, and wisdom as an ethos for today's witch, and focuses upon relationships with the plant realm, the patterns of astrology, the use of trance in the craft. He's an author of many books, including the Temple of Witchcraft series and The Mighty Dead. His vision is of an evolving witchcraft culture, making magic accessible to everyone, yet preserving the heart of the mystery. For more information, please visit ChristopherPenczak.com or go to templeofwitchcraft.org. You can be a big help to the show by subscribing and rating Weird Web Radio on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and any other app where you happen to listen or subscribe to your favorite podcasts. Let your friends and family and familiars know that you like this show and help show it some love. Share the show, your favorite episodes on social media, and help get the word out to everyone. You can also gain access to all the bonus audio sessions that I hold with the guests, along with a lot of other rewards, again, by joining the membership. And all you have to do is go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or weirdwebradio.com. The bonus audio section, $5 a month. Literally buying me one coffee at Starbucks every month, and I thank you for it. The funding that keeps building and growing from that membership can help this show do bigger and better things. Thank you for tuning in again. Stay weird, my friends.
Christopher, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
That's great to hear. I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to come and play this little Q&A game that I like to call a podcast. So let's see if we can deliver some pretty great content and benefit to the people listening.
Absolutely.
I got to thinking about how I wanted to start this interview with you because we've been scheduled for a while, and I take different approaches over time on how I'd like to get conversation started. But you presented this opportunity, I think, that I haven't really had with anyone else. When I say the word witchcraft to a lot of people who are practicing witchcraft today, your name is literally synonymous with the word witchcraft in the overwhelming majority of those people. So, I have to wonder, when you got started into witchcraft, did you foresee having this great impact and influence on the community?
I have to say, in no way, shape, or form. When I got started in witchcraft, I really had no desire to be public. I had no desire actually to teach. I kind of all fell into the vocation of witchcraft, which was not, my plan, I think, because I've joked to a lot of people I wanted to be a rock star. My degree's in music. I worked in the music industry. And that was right around when I was first getting training, was when I was in college for music. So I really, had very humble aspirations. I actually almost didn't go forward in my training. The way I was taught through Laurie Cabot was you start out with the idea of witchcraft as an occult philosophy, as a science. And when it got to the semi-religious stuff, I was like, oh, former Catholic, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is too almost Catholic, the ceremony of cakes and ale and circles and rituals and things like that. And it really took my mom, who was actually studying with me at the same time, although strangely, she thought I was joining a cult. So she tagged along to make sure I wasn't doing anything dangerous. But she finally got to the point where she's like, no, this is totally different than being Catholic. And at the time I was like, how so? And she's like, you get to be the priest. There's no intermediary. Whatever you determine is sacred, however you want to do it, once you understand it, is up to you. You've got that, I guess I'd say today, agency. You've got that responsibility to it. And that totally shifted my view and had me go deeper into it. But I really had no grand designs, despite, some people thinking like I had a great plan for what I was doing. I fell into a lot of things by accident.
I couldn't help but wonder because, 20 plus years ago, when I started getting interested in the occult and paganism, everybody was always telling you, I guess, first of all, there wasn't a lot out there to get your hands on anyway. But everybody would always say, well, go get, we called it Uncle Bucky's Big Blue Book of Wicca.
Yeah. I remember actually sharing that with somebody in England, a Gardnerian high priest in England who had never heard that in England and thought that was hilarious that we called him Uncle Bucky.
Yeah. So, even whether you like that or not, it was kind of like one of the very few ways that someone could get their foot into practicing modern witchcraft. Of course, there's plenty of other options that are available today, but yet you sort of occupy that dominant space almost that I think Buckland once occupied.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that thought. And, Raymond was a huge influence on me, even though his practices weren't my practices, just his desire to make it accessible and available to people. I think he was really the first. And, that's really influenced my perspective on wanting to make things accessible to people and wanting to kind of I do believe in mystery, but I don't necessarily always believe in secrets. So, to be able to give people the maps to be able to find their way on their own, I think he did that to the best of his ability of what was available and what he wanted to share at that time. And I really appreciate that. So any comparison on that level is really flattering to me, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's well earned. Sorry for the cough.
I feel you. Recovering myself.
Right. Now, you talk about when you got involved in witchcraft, you had this bit of a resistance from a Catholic upbringing. And, I heard a joke one time. I don't remember who said it, exactly how it went, but it was something to the effect of you see more witchcraft happening in Protestant areas where there's not so much ritual from people coming out of Christianity. But with that resistance in the beginning, what drew you into witchcraft anyway? I mean, how do you find yourself being pulled in that direction?
I was, I'd say, uncomfortably agnostic, being raised Catholic and going to Catholic school the last 4 years in all boys Catholic prep school. When I finally got out, I knew I believed that there was some type of power, but I didn't really have articulation for it, and I think in those days, with there not being, it was back in the days where you went pre Barnes and Noble, pre big bookstores, where you'd find 10 books in the bookstore, and one was the Satanic Bible, and that was your options at the time. And you might get Starhawk and Uncle Bucky's Big Blue Book and maybe a Scott Cunningham book. I was looking for something. So I went into Eastern stuff. I started studying with a yoga teacher, and got a little bit of Hinduism for that. Buddhism interested me, but I think at that time too, those things weren't as accessible as they are today. So the philosophies were interesting and the art was very interesting, but the closest I could actually get was like yoga at a gym. So it wasn't really the deeper spiritual mysteries or the tantra or anything, explaining that. I'm sure I could have found it, but I was probably lazy. I was 18, 19 at the time. So I just kind of kept searching, and a very old childhood friend, who was my first boss in high school, gave me my first job. And we're just friends, like that kind of adult friend that you have, growing up. And she introduced me very slowly to the concepts of paganism and witchcraft. And it was back in the days where you didn't tell minors. Like, it was pre-pagan families, it was pre-spiral scouts, it was pre a lot of the religious freedoms being more open than they are today. And she was afraid of telling anybody under 18. So she waited till I was 18, and she slowly kind of broached the subject. And then she was finally like, oh, you get it, I'm a witch, right? And I thought that was hilarious. I didn't think that was something that was real. But over time, she introduced me to what she practiced in her coven. And I found a great interest. At first, I thought she joined a cult and I wanted to rescue her. But once I realized that wasn't true, I was like, oh, this has a certain philosophy to it. And then she introduced me to Laurie Cabot, which kind of led me on my way there.
That's funny. You thought she had joined a cult. I can see where the concern would appear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just seems so outlandish at that time. This was probably early 90s, 90, 91. People weren't really calling themselves witches.
That's true. Yeah. So you get involved in this coven in the early days. You start feeling it out. We already know you had some of that slight resistance because of similarities to Catholic ritual and so on. So, what happened that convinced you that witchcraft wasn't just a ceremony, that it was something deeper and something more real that you had to dedicate so much of your life to?
Well, I think it was finally the actual psychic experiences and the magical experiences. When I first was involved with this group of witches, I wasn't officially a member of the coven. I was kind of like an honorary guest because I was her friend and she felt that I needed to be there. But I never formally initiated into that coven. But I got a chance to do a full moon spell, a petition spell, and had this amazing experience with it. I was still of that kind of Catholic mindset of not wanting to feel guilty getting stuff for yourself. So I did a healing spell for a friend of mine that was in a really difficult situation health-wise. And miraculous is the only way I could describe it. And I'm sure today, looking back on it, she had people praying for her and doing all sorts of other magical-esque things for her. But it was somebody who was having a very difficult pregnancy, and the baby wasn't expected to survive, and her health was very, very ill at the time. And in the spell, I wrote it in such a way that said that the mother be fine, the baby be fine, and the labor be as easy as possible. And so in that process, the labor was 2 hours long. Like, unexpectedly, she turned around from when the spell was to when she gave birth, which was about 4 weeks. And she had an amazing, amazing turnaround. The labor was super easy. She was healthy. The baby was healthy. And she was like, oh, I don't know, wonder why everyone was worried. That was fine. And hearing that, I was like, wow, that's witchcraft. Like, that's no way that happens with your first baby. So that kind of was the door opening. And then this particular teacher and coven taught me how to read tarot. And they used to run psychic fairs in the area. And I worked the door for one of the psychic fairs. And one of the psychics didn't show up. And so they had an empty table. And she just grabbed me. She was like, do you have your cards with me? And, it was back in the days where you carried your cards everywhere. And so I was like, yeah, of course. And she's like, okay, you're reading today. And suddenly I found myself from never having a professional reading experience to working an 8-hour shift with a lunch break, and realizing, wow, this is really real and something that I can do. And then she kind of sent me to Laurie Cabot. And one of Laurie Cabot's big kind of catalytic experiences for her students is basically what she calls psychic diagnosis or psychic healing cases, where you get the information about a person you've never met. So just their name, their age, and their city of residence. and you tune into them psychically, and you can physically describe them. And then they're usually somebody who's had some type of physical illness that's been verified and diagnosed by a doctor. And you tune into what that illness is very specifically, and then you send them healing. And sometimes the amazing part is the healing, because they do have a miraculous recovery. Sometimes it's that you're able to get information in such a nonlinear way. And I was still kind of philosophically maybe a witch at that point, but still kind of agnostic, and believed, there's a science to it, and there's, certain principles, but I wasn't sure exactly what they were. And even at that time, after the tarot, I still thought, well, maybe other people can do this, but I don't know if it's really for me. And then after that experience, it was just mind blowing. And I've had other initiations and ceremonies and all sorts of wonderful stuff that a lot of us go through. But to me, that was really the initiatory experience that opened the gate to the mysteries to me, because I said there's no possible way this could be real unless magic is real, unless psychic ability is real. So if this part is real, maybe all the other things they're saying have some merit, and I just haven't figured out what exactly it means. And maybe things that look kind of, to me at the time, maybe hokey and superstitious, maybe they had reasons behind them too. So that's why I kind of later embraced the robes and the cords and the jewelry and, understanding spells and potions, which seemed kind of archaic to me at that time. I liked the psychic magic, but, I found merit in all of those things in time.
What is it about witchcraft that interests you the most, even still today?
I would say that for me, witchcraft is all about change and the juxtaposition between nature, and I know a lot of people hate this word, but supernature. The supernatural, not in a hokey kind of movie way, but that which is natural but is unseen or is beyond our normal senses and our normal measurements. I think it's still natural, but I think it goes beyond what we can all kind of agree upon. And where those two things intersect, whether it be with the forest and the herbs and the plant magic and the stone magic, or whether it be traversing other worlds and exploring other realms of consciousness, to me, that intersection point of how you bring it into your life is really interesting. And I think if you keep the practice, it never gets old if you're truly practicing it. I think you can get into rote, busyness and kind of forget the mystery of it. But I think it's a great adventure. And I think the best witches I know are always seeking and exploring and having an adventure. And that's what interests me the most. I think that's why I haven't left it. I used to tell people I was deeply involved in the idea of alchemy before I got into witchcraft, but in the early 90s and, in a suburban New Hampshire, there's no chance of really finding an alchemy teacher. I think if I found an alchemy teacher, I would have been that before a witch. But I also think the intersection of service has been a huge part for me. As much as it's a challenge and it can be difficult, I really kind of groove to the idea of the cunning one at the edge of the village and the struggle today about how do we incorporate that into modern life, because people have psychologists and therapists and doctors and all sorts of other things. So it's where does the witch fit into that? Because I find sometimes those things fail people and they're still seeking out the magic. And I'd like to create situations where I'm not the person's last hope, but they can kind of come to me in the beginning if they wish. And I think I've done that pretty well over the last 20 years. So it's then helping other people figure out where their vocations are too. So between the adventure and the service, I think those are the two things that keep bringing me back.
Yeah, I like that you bring up, one, the service to others. And you keep thinking about where does the witch fit in, because I want to talk to you about that. When you think about, first of all, the word witch, what all does that encompass?
It changes over the years. So I think the answer I could give you now is probably different than the last time I was asked this. But for me, I was always taught and kind of embraced, and it might not be the vogue thing to talk about right now. But people who are modern witches are kind of inheriting different threads. So I think on one hand, I love looking back to this idea of a diverse culture in terms of a Neolithic shamanic, before there were borders on the map and people had a lot of similarities in their practices. And that's the origin place of magic. And, that's one of the origins of witch, but it's shaman, it's druid, it's, all these different practitioners might find their roots in this point. And I love that because it's a commonality that brings us all together. I think, as we look at the arc of history, whether it be a mythic history or little history, we're always kind of debating what was real in witchcraft. I think if you wait 20 years, the story of, anything that we verify through archaeology will even change and new information will come up. But I think we have kind of a mythos. And in that mythos, I feel like I've inherited on one side the temple priestesses and the temple priests and the people who were engaged in their society in a religious context, because they didn't really have any other context. There was no civil society. So the temple priest and priestesses of the old pagan gods, and how they serve their community and how they serve the gods are kind of a thread. And then I think the village cunning folk, the people who, dealt with blessing the fields, what kind of survived after Christianity took over in Europe. I think that's another thread that we kind of inherit. And I think we're struggling in good ways. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think we're struggling with what do we do with all those threads, and each witch might be heavier with a particular thread. And then that heaviness of what thread is really influencing you may change over life. I think right now I'm really influenced by the restoration of temple traditions and what does witchcraft look like in that, or what does being a priest or a priestess look like being in that. Where if you asked me this, a good 15 years ago, I was really about the individual practitioner seeing clients and giving remedies and doing readings and that type of stuff. And I didn't necessarily want to be involved in something larger. So I think it switches over time, but I think to me, those are the threads that really encompass the inheritance of the witch, so one of the kind of common definitions is that walker between worlds, but I think we're walking between all those three worlds. And it's not just flesh and spirit in our personal practices, but it's all these different points in history of what a witch is or could be, even if they didn't use those words. I know that witches are definitely, historically considered illicit practitioners outside of their community, but I know my teachers also talked about the Druids as being a thread of understanding witchcraft, and from at least a Celtic perspective. And the old temple priestesses in Greece and Rome and Egypt, and all of that has kind of informed my witchcraft, even though they might not technically use that word. So I know people tend to be a little bit more snarky about it today and try to draw the harder lines, and I think that's great if that works for them. But I know for me, I inherited a lot of different threads, and that they still influence where I'm at, and I'm not ready to give any of those up.
Yeah, that's a great sales pitch to anybody who was thinking about becoming a witch.
So much for no proselytizing, but okay.
Well, I tell you, if somebody had found me when I was 15 and gave me that same speech, I would have been much more involved in witchcraft than the paths I took. That was a great way to explain it. But with all of that said, witchcraft seems to be having this, I don't know if I want to call it a boom or not, but certainly a lot more attention is being given in our culture. It's getting more popular as a theme on TV shows. It's appearing as this sort of conversation of the aesthetic in magazine articles. And I think it's appealing more and more to people out there as they're looking for some sort of spiritual answer, getting out of this sort of middle ground as people have left their childhood religions and embraced some materialist atheism, but yet still feel this yearning. And witchcraft seems to be filling in that gap more than a lot of other things. How should I say this? In our Western culture, what role does the witch play now? Or what do you think the witch should be doing in this situation?
I think that trend that you described is a cycle. I could say, I felt and saw that just as I was getting into publishing. I think I was on the low end of that cycle. The authors that were a generation before me were part of the first Sabrina craze, were part of the first Charmed craze, were part of the first Buffy craze. And I think we could say similar things at that time. I think whenever there's distressing times, the archetype and the image and the power of the witch rises up in our consciousness. I think there was a lot of unrest and uncertainty, in the late 90s into 2000 of what's going to happen with the world. And I think that's, the last real big time we had it, kind of coming up. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now and a lot of difficulty in community and politics and the state of the world. And I think it's coming up again because it is such a empowering process and path, regardless of whether you have a teacher or not. I think there's many ways to be a witch. What I think the role of the witch is in these times or in these situations, I go back to all the deities that I work with that are light bearers. A lot of times we have this idea that the gods of witchcraft are the dark and scary and difficult, and they can be. But really the purpose of so many of them, and who's so popular today right now, but the Queen of Witches, Hecate, is the idea of bearing the torch, bearing the lamp, bearing the light. Our tradition uses a lot of imagery of the idea of the witch fire within, the triple flame, and the idea of kind of drawing out the light of consciousness, the light of gnosis, into dark places, and particularly bearing it into places where other people won't go. So one of the reasons why I've been so involved in service and community building, and even kind of outside of the pagan community, how do we serve, is I think a lot of people who are not comfortable going to Christian institutions, don't trust them, not comfortable going to government institutions, and finding support that way. I think it's supporting, those who are on the outside, because I think the witch is on the outside, but I think the witch is also the caretaker, the priest of those who stand on the outside. So a big part of the mission of our temple and my public work and the people I train is to be available for those who are the outsiders, which can be difficult, but bearing that light, whether it's the light of awareness, whether it's the light of consciousness, whether it's the light of compassion, whether it's the light of healing, but being kind of a light bearer in the world is a significant part of my image of the witch.
Yeah, that craze you were talking about, the Buffy. Buffy was probably the hard-edged version of it all back then. The first round of Sabrina and Charmed. You can look at all of those then and say they sort of had soft edges. They were more accessible, I think, to a lot of people. That witch aesthetic, that popularity of the witch in TV and entertainment has a lot more sharp teeth these days. We're talking about the rebirth of Buffy with a much darker twist, more in tune with the old graphic novels. Coven from American Horror Story. You certainly wouldn't want to make those ladies mad.
But I think it's easy to dismiss what came before, and if you realize what came before, although by today's standards are very tame by comparison, or even kitschy, I think at the time there were a lot of people who were really worried about them. I think those paved the way, and then it kind of went underground again, and people were interested in other things. And now the resurgence of it, I think the world feels even more desperate, at this moment. So I think our art reflects that. I think if you've been living in the modern world, any place and it's hard not to feel like the world is going mad. And I think our art reflects that difficulty and that division and that anger and that sense of injustice that we're having. So I think whether it be, a little bit more traditional horror, or whether it be a little bit more anti-establishment, in some of it, or whether it be a little bit more about justice. I even think the books we're writing right now are a little bit darker and deeper in both good and bad ways, or helpful or less helpful ways. But I think it's that reflects what's going on in the popular consciousness. But I do think, that kind of resurgence of the aesthetic, I love and hate at the same time, because I think it's more than an aesthetic, but, I think we all get into it for different reasons. And if someone likes the look of something and that causes them to go deeper, who am I to say they shouldn't have done that? That's great. That got them to the gods, that got them to magic. Or if they liked American Horror Story Coven or the new Sabrina or whatever it is, whatever kind of gets them to it. I just sometimes am concerned that people confuse the fiction with the reality of the practice. So sometimes they're disappointed, or sometimes they bring in less helpful notions to the greater community. And I guess it's the filtration process of, you bring an idea in, or popular consciousness and media brings an idea in, and either it sinks or swims, or either it kind of develops and changes and becomes a part of things over time and brings fresh ideas in, or, it becomes very clear that it's not a part of it. Yeah. It's interesting to be in the middle of things, because I think it's easy to see what's happened after certain processes, but when you're in the midst of them as a community, it's kind of hard to watch. And it's a good thing, but it's hard to see where it's going.
Yeah, we have the same thing happen in heathenry. People see the Thor movies, and they start thinking,
Yes.
they start getting certain ideas in their head about what it might be, or they watch the Vikings on the History Channel and they think it might be something more like that, and they'll quickly discover that none of that is that's entertainment. But it does, as you said, it does bring people to the door, and it will shake out those who are actually seeking the mysteries, as opposed to those who are seeking some fictional power. Have I lost you?
Yep,
All right,
good.
It got so quiet. I thought, damn, did he hang up?
I'm agreeing. I should verbalize my head shaking.
No, that's okay. All right. You started out in witchcraft with no intention to become this name that is synonymous with witchcraft. So what was the catalyst that made you start writing those books?
It was probably the teaching a little bit before that. So once I got kind of my basic training, I was just using it as empowering my life. And, and the training that I had wasn't coven traditional British Wicca type of things where you stayed with the coven for a long period of time. You got your training and then you went out and did your own thing and you could form your own groups, and it was really independent, which I really liked. So my first group was with my mother, who thought I was joining the cult and decided that, she wanted to join the cult too. And she left the Catholic Church. And my spiritual sister, whom we formed like a little triad coven. And then people started to notice that, our lives improved. And, I think I went from a fairly, it sounds very dramatic, and I was probably a much less angry young man than I thought I was. But, I thought at the time I was presenting, angry young man, closeted gay man coming out of Catholic school, going into music school, joining a heavy metal band, all this kind of rebellious stuff. And then like a flip switched and people started noticing I was happier, more centered, more grounded. And they wanted to know what was going on. So for the first year or two, I'd sent them to my first mentor was really not public. She was a business owner in the town that we lived in. And she really was very selective about who could come over and who knew she was a reader and that type of stuff. It was very old worldly. But Laurie Cabot was very open, and people in Salem were very open. So I sent people who were like, what are you doing? And that awkward moment where like, do I say I'm a witch? Do I not say I'm a witch? And, in those days you kind of went through a gamut of words to get there. You'd be like earth religions. And then if they were okay with that, it was pagan. And then if they were okay with that, you'd say, well, technically it's Wicca. And if they got through that, then you'd be like, I'm a witch. And even some of those words are differently defined today now than they were then. It was all kind of a lead up to, what we were practicing. And we didn't really see a lot of differences between all the different types of witchcraft and paganism out there at the time. And then if they got through that, I'd be like, oh, you should go check out Laurie Cabot. She's doing a ritual down here. You should go check out this reader here. And because I didn't really want the responsibility. I didn't care. I was really about self-empowerment, and I had no plans of teaching. So I thought, oh, these people should get empowered too. Go study with who I studied with. And then, at that time in her life, Laurie took a step back. She was having some problems and some conflicts. And my teacher wasn't taking anybody. And then she was having some problems and conflicts. And then so people started to end up on my door and saying like, oh, can you show me this? And so I ended up just being kind, trying to show little things here and there. And suddenly I found myself, our book club of the once a month kind of turned into a meditation circle. And then that meditation circle turned into sort of an informal class. And suddenly I found myself more often than not leading the class. And then people asked me for very, well, what was your training? We'd like that training, not just these one-off topics. And I gave it some thought, and I decided just to kind of guide them through what I learned and what I would add to it. And that was actually the first Inner Temple of Witchcraft class back in 97. And then that group of people foolishly told other people. And then I suddenly found myself with another class, and that group of people were like, well, what's next? And, I took them to the next round of training I had, and they're like, what's next? And I was like, well, I didn't really have any more training, but I had, this is what I'm working on right now, and I can share it with you. And then, going through a year of that, and then what's next? And I was like, well, this is what I'm working on now. And it kind of synthesized and cobbled together into a system that was not my intention. It was just really kind of showing the basics of occultism through a witch's lens. And that eventually became my temple books, although those weren't the first books I wrote. And as people started to share who they were studying with, and because it was academically modeled in classes, and it wasn't, to commit to a coven in the same sort of way, and I wasn't committing to them in that way, and they weren't committing to me, it got a bit popular. And then my coven of 3 decided that, we'd start opening Samhain up to people so they could see what rituals were like, because it was hard to, if you were just coming to class, to really get a feel for what it was like to practice. So we started opening up Samhain, and we opened up Beltane, and then we opened up the coven, and the coven sort of grew. And then that coven started hosting, a lot more things. And then from that point on, I was still working in Boston in the music industry, and I was really struggling with running this group while trying to do my career and trying to be a musician and trying to take care of other musicians. I worked in A&R at a studio turned record label called Fort Apache in the Boston area. And, we had connections with MCA Records and distribution through them. So it was a lot of, high-end music type of stuff. And that was really where my focus was. And so I found myself doing a lot of witchcraft in the park on lunch break because I didn't have time. I was out late at night. And I kept really good notes on, all my adaptions of things. And that notebook eventually became City Magic. And so I ended up getting laid off from my music job, and I had this book that was half finished, and I decided to turn it into something that other people could read. It wasn't just a notebook. And that started kind of my writing career, and had a very profound vision right before I was laid off from my job, where the matron goddess that I work with, an Irish goddess, an aspect of the Morrigan named Maka, would really just show up in my meditations and kind of yell at me and just be like, you need to teach more. And I'm thinking, like, I'm doing something once a month. What more do you want from me? And she'd just be like, you need to teach more, and got very vehement about it. And when I finally said yes in meditation, she disappeared, was kicked out of the vision. And 3 days later, I lost my job. And when I went back into meditation, she's like, see, you can teach more now. And from that moment on, I've been professionally doing this through seeing clients and doing readings and teaching classes. And then the books kind of took off. And the classes that I taught eventually became probably my more popular books, this Temple of Witchcraft series of books. And it was really the books I wished that I had to train with. They were really, detailed lessons, trying to give both the history and the how-to and the why behind it. And it was really rich in technique and a little less on this is a tradition. But it's kind of weird. It's kind of evolved into its own tradition since then with the community of people I've taught. But people who just want the techniques can always kind of go back to the books and just kind of go back to the root material and do it their own way too, which I'm glad that there's that flexibility in the system.
Yeah. Now, what makes the temple, as you refer to it, different from the other traditions that are out there?
Yeah, I like to say that it was a series of classes that became a system. The system kind of grew into a community, and then the community grew into a tradition, and then the tradition formed our nonprofit to kind of support all of this around it. So, we didn't really have original aspirations to be a tradition. So I think that's probably the most different thing, around us. It's really a tradition of technique, first and foremost. Our shared experiences with certain material and the sequence that material goes in is really what bonds us together. Rather than being focused on a particular culture or even a particular vision of deity, and practices, there's a lot of open-endedness to it, which is what people both love and hate about it. The people who resonate with it, that's what draws them in, and the people we lose who get kind of mad or get confused don't like the wide variety of options to it, because essentially there's 4 degrees of kind of foundational training and then a 5th degree of high priest, high priestess ministerial training. And once you're done, wherever you decide to stop, we don't have a core, like these are the things you should do every day. We look at the wide palette of we've given you and say, well, what do you want to do? And what else can you add to this? And where's your path taking you? I look at the tradition itself as kind of like a cooperative. It's a cooperative of both people and spirits and deities. So since we work with spirits and deities in terms of function, if you have a particular deity that you love that wants to fulfill that function in the process, you can bring them into the process. So you don't have to give up any deity you feel a connection to, or you don't have to put them aside, or you're not asked to focus on any particular vision. But we might be working with, let's say in the 2nd degree, there's a big thing on the master of the forge. So in that experience, the master in the forge may be Vulcan, the master in the forge may be Bridget, who shows up for you. And we also encourage people, although they may have a clear sense of who they want to show up, to really be open to who actually shows up. Like if you've been practicing Celtic material for all your time and you're really certain that it's going to be a Celtic forge god that shows up, and then, suddenly Tubal Cain shows up, we'd be like, well, see what Tubal Cain has to say to you, because that might be a message that the Celtic deity might not be able to get through to you at this time. And we're not saying you can't worship the Celtic deity. We're just saying, be open to who shows up in terms of an occult process. And even though we define it legally as a religion, I think it's much more about the mystical experiences of the religion than specific worship. There's a lot of cooperation in the process. And sometimes people will come into it and bring a particular deity that they work closely with. And even if that person leaves, sometimes the deity stays in the community and starts showing up for other people. So I think that's a fairly unique thing that doesn't show up in a lot of formal traditions. And the other big thing about it is the tradition. It's my firm belief in seeing it go wrong in a lot of ways. Not everybody who wants to go through all the training is really cut out to lead a coven, to teach, to minister. And I think there's a lot of different ways to serve. And I think a lot of people get discouraged because they either can't or don't want to fulfill that kind of parental mode of, kind of growing up, and there's the kind of parents of the high priest and high priestess, and you get elevated and you hive off and you kind of create your own little coven family. I think when that's held well, it does really, really wonderful things to people. And I think when that's not held well, it can do really disastrous things to people. And if that's what you're seeking, that's awesome. But that wasn't what I was seeking. I was not really looking for family. I had a pretty good family background. The kind of process that can happen in covens wasn't really what I was looking for as an adult. So I really wanted to find and work with people who might want to enter deeply into the mysteries, might want to lead and work in community, but their skill sets might be different. So, where's the place for the high priestess or high priest that can really plan a good fundraising party? Where's the place for the person who really wants to do environmental or social justice work? Where's the person who really just wants to, be with people or feels called to sit with people who are in the dying process? Whereas the person who really just wants to focus on healing but doesn't really want to lead a group. So we set up 12 ministries, and each ministry has, different areas of service and mystery. And, you can become a high priestess and never actually decide that you have to run a group or teach a coven or run a Sabbath if that's not what you want. You learn the basic processes, and we ask you to lead rituals at different times and participate in public ritual. But once you graduate, if you find that's not for you, there's a lot of different ways to serve and be a part of community and to take lead in things. Because, not every good high priestess should be running a fundraiser. It's different skill sets. Not every person should be doing media and speaking to the public, and speaking to TV and newspapers. That's a different skill set too. So we try to get people to go where they're called and where they can serve best.
That is amazing. It's very detailed. I like how you break it all down. I think you've provided an excellent framework for people to find their calling and a path within their own witchcraft. And I certainly think you deserve a great deal of recognition for the work you've put into that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, in there you were talking about you don't expect people to have this daily practice. They need to find what works for them and everything else. But I'm curious what your own regular personal practice looks like. Do you have daily work that you do?
Absolutely. And I will back it up. I will say, for the deeper mysteries, I do expect you to have a daily practice. I don't expect to dictate what your daily practice is, though. That's a little bit of a difference. So I want people to know that, sometimes the biggest complaint we get too is like, wow, I didn't know there's gonna be so much homework in this. And I was like, wow, I would have killed for this level of detailed instruction. And, when I was getting into it. But my own practice is pretty detailed, is pretty regimented. I'm a big believer in witchcraft as priesthood, so I think even though we're of the world and we've got to hold down our jobs and hold down our lives and our households and everything, I think there's a certain kind of inner world cloister to it. And I think holding up the day, whether it be a daily practice, or a morning, evening practice, ideally when, everyone's healthy, I think is a good thing to have. My own practice has a morning component to start the day, which is usually a little bit simpler because I'm not a great morning person. So it's what I'd call an altar devotional and a lighting of a lamp and a little bit of incense and a little bit of aligning yourself with the directions and saying, for lack of a better word, a morning prayer or morning devotional to set intention for the day. And then evening magic is probably where things get a little bit more mystical. My own practice tends to be a lot of inner world visionary journey, communication with spirits, energy work type of stuff. Not that I'm against ritual, and ritual's been a big part of my practice, but that's kind of just where I've been for the last few years in terms of, kind of stillness and silence and a lot of inner work. A lot of the work that I'm doing right now is really exploratory. I feel like the culture of witchcraft in general and witchcraft as our temple is about really deepening the culture and the imagery and the mythos. So sometimes it's taking work with the deity, or a mythic image, and trying to go deeper and exploring that in a visionary state, in another world trance state, and seeing what maps can be made, and then starting to share those maps with the advanced practitioners and seeing what they got out of it. And then if that seems safe, then sharing it with, newer students and general public. And it's kind of how I do my R&D for all my classes and workshop and everything. I never really kind of unveil something that only I've done. I like to really share it with a lot of people and get a lot of feedback on how things work for a lot of different people, not just me. But I think a lot of it is very inner world visionary and inner world energetic. Plant material is a huge part of my daily practice. So whether it be an oil, a flower essence, a potion, a tincture of some sort, making that a part of my daily practice. We've got currently right now a side group in the temple that's doing kind of a unique turning of the wheel. We do very public Sabbats, but we have a smaller group that's working privately on Sabbats in a group of 13. And rather than, we don't have a coven structure in a traditional sense. So this group, each person carries a role for a year, whether it be an elemental bearer or a particular priest or priestess role. And my job in it this year is the sorcerer. The sorcerer is really in charge of all the spellcraft. And part of what we do is we divine a flower essence at the end of each Sabbat, and we take that to the next Sabbat. So for Imbolc, we divined peppermint, which is about spiritual digestion. So every morning I do a little tune in with peppermint, and I take my 3 drops and I try to figure out, what am I digesting today, or what am I not digesting that I need to do a little bit better with or release. So the idea of plant spirits is a huge part of my personal practice, and just kind of little ways to tune into nature, even when we're indoors and even when we're, in the wintertime and not out as much.
What do you see as controversial right now going on in the witchcraft community or larger pagan community? And what do you think about it?
I think there's a lot of controversial things going on right now. I think there's a lot of division. I think as something gets bigger, everybody tries to distinguish or differentiate themselves from other people. Even when I think of back, when I started, and even, my teachers before me, there wasn't as much division between the different pagan communities, and there wasn't even that much division between witches. And it was interesting, I think if you do the festival circuits and you talk to a lot of people, you start to see things in the microcosm before they start growing. So I would say probably, 2008, 2009, around that time, you started to see the move to traditional craft, and at that time, a lot of people were talking about, the purity of pre-Gardnerian traditions and seeking out lineages much in the same way. And I think a lot about the Robert Cochrane material and Cultus Sabbati, which I find great inspiration in both those things, and a lot of tradcraft. I think my own traditions and teachers never really defined themselves solely from Gardnerian style Wicca, but that was a huge influence. So I think, at one point there was this big backlash, wanting to do everything but Gardnerian Wicca style things, and particularly, having a division then between Gardnerian Alexandrian style Wicca and the solitary eclectic of Raymond Buckland stuff and Scott Cunningham particularly. And there being a division between that too, which I don't think there was as much of a division when I started, or at least it wasn't as vocal. And then as things have kind of moved into the larger cultural conference context now, we find that a lot of the tradcraft teachings are now like, well, how you can bring tradcraft to everybody, where before it was a little bit more exclusionary. And now we're having more books about American tradcraft. And I'm looking forward to reading, Besom Stangen-Sword and got that on my list, and some really exciting things that are out there right now. So it's I think things shift, but I think there have been these kind of controversies of division, and I think ultimately, things will come back together and things will come back apart, solve and coagula, that separation and purification and return back again, which I think is just, part of the alchemical magical process. So of course it's going to happen in community. I think another controversy right now is the idea of activism. A lot of us kind of came, myself included, from a British traditional occultism, even though it wasn't British traditional Wicca. Definitely my teachers had that Western occultist, Dion Fortune, Golden Dawn. You don't talk about certain things. You don't talk about politics. You don't bring this up. You don't bring that up. Yet witchcraft historically has a huge political context and has a huge social justice context to it. And people are really trying to recognize that. And I think there's a bit of a division between those who want to recognize that and those who don't. I think it's a necessary thing to look at. And then it kind of gets into, well, now that we've recognized it, what's appropriate action, and everything from resistance through magic and social justice work, which is really talked about a lot now, to the ideas of cursing and cursing your enemies, both personally and politically. And what is right action, between those things. And I think that's a struggle, because I think people's ethics, when I started, even if you didn't identify as Wiccan, the Wiccan read was just that, a read. It was like a good idea until you're really clear about it. And now a lot of people start out immediately throwing out that idea, which I think in some ways was good training wheel. I think I would have been monstrous if I didn't have the Wiccan read and I was 18 doing witchcraft, and I see some 18-year-olds doing witchcraft kind of throwing away the Wiccan read, and I think sometimes they're monstrous. So I think it's figuring out, what's right action, what's appropriate. I had a teacher who said, never do something with magic you wouldn't be willing to do in the physical. And I think that's been a pretty good guide. Although I've also had people point it out to me when we discuss curses and we discuss the history. And I teach people curses at the very least as a practitioner, because if you get a client who's cursed, you need to recognize, well, how was it done? And why was it done? And what's its effect? And how do you take it off? So I'm not adverse to talking about those topics, but I'm not keen on practicing them personally, from that standpoint. But I've had people point out to me like, oh, the things, that you're doing, Christopher, those could be considered to be curses. And I'm like, oh, I always consider that to be justice, So I think it depends on how people, frame things and look at things, but I think being willing to accept the consequences of your actions, taking action, not just in a magical way, but a mundane way. If you're constantly doing magic for resistance, but you don't take any actual political action when you feel there needs to be change, I think that can be a problem. I think you have to do both to be effective. And I think those are the controversies, at least the big ones right now that I can see. I'm sure there's more that I haven't heard of, but
yeah,
that's where I'm at right now.
The nature of controversies is they will get your attention eventually.
Yeah. I guess the other big controversy is gender in community and gender identification, and what kind of roles do we have with gender right now, and what are appropriate roles, with gender. Coming from that occultist point of view, the Kabbalion, the principle of gender, and there's polarity in gender and all things. But I was always taught that it was never, literal physical plumbing chromosomes. It was the idea that the energies are found in all things and are expressed in unique combinations. So our communities never had, a lot of difficulties with people with other gender identifications and trans identifications, and now non-binary. And I think a lot of the terminology is changing over the years. And I think we just have to be open and sensitive and hear how people are identifying. But I think from an occult perspective, I don't see it as a problem, but I know a lot of people do, so, but as a queer man, polyamorous, running a non-gender based witchcraft tradition, it's not a big deal to me. And we have a pretty high trans and queer population, although not as high as people think. Sometimes people think that the Temple of Witchcraft is all queer people, but honestly, it's mostly straight and bisexual women, which I think is a pretty common demographic for witchcraft in general.
Yeah, I think you're right. You didn't become a monster, and we're all grateful for that.
Some people may disagree with that, but I appreciate that.
But with that said, what was one of your biggest mistakes?
Oh, so many. Which one would I pick? I would say a big and repeated mistake for me, which I still struggle with today, is not, it's going to sound very trite and it's going to sound, very Oprah-esque, but it's not seeing people when they're showing you who they are. I think compassion is a big part of my practice. And I think sometimes I've held the door open too long and given too many chances and too many benefits to people who did not use them in good faith, or maybe couldn't, for whatever their background may be. I recognize that. But the biggest regrets I've had is when my desire to be compassionate and hold open the door for one person has had detrimental effects, not just for me, but for other people. That has been a theme, because I do believe in the regeneration of all people. I do believe in the rectification of all world. I do believe that no one is unworthy. But I think on a practical level, sometimes you've got to just say, yep, this is not working. And I think we're done here because, this is not appropriate behavior. And I think I've erred too much on the person who's been harmful in the hopes that they were getting better. And I think that's caused harm to people who did not deserve it. And I regret that deeply.
And we all know that you teach, and of course the temple is there for people to find their way into an excellent training program to become, a witch and find their own expression of it. But what sort of advice would you tell the seeker out there to avoid?
That's a great question. I would say, any seeker seeking, who's brand new to it, is to read and observe a lot. If you're going to join a group, don't join, or a tradition or anything, don't rush too quickly into it. Really observe the people and make sure it's the right choice for you. I think, maybe back in our talking about controversies, I think one of the difficulties, particularly with social media right now, is that sense of personal loyalty. A lot of people have a very us against the world or us against them kind of view, and they feel that once you've joined something, you owe that person or you owe that group a loyalty that is not always commensurate with their actions. So I'd say, be hesitant of who you give your loyalty to, and clear choices. Honestly, in the end, I think if you're really loyal to somebody and they've made a mistake, a good measure of that is to be able to speak to them and say, hey, I've got a problem, and that they can respond well to that rather than cast you out as well. But I think seekers, there's just so much information out there. I think sometimes there's also a desire to dive deep, in the beginning and not really have your training wheels. I use the analogy in training a lot, which people often hate, of learning an art, whether it be music, whether it be a graphic art, whether it be a sport, whether it be a martial art, whatever it may be, that, if you're brand new to something, you're always going to learn the baby steps of something and really get a good foundation down before you try to do something deep and complex. I can't tell you how many emails I get from people asking questions, and it's very clear from their email that they're not experienced practitioners, and they're asking something about, like, how do I call upon a goetic demon, or how do I open an Enochian ether? And I'm like, perhaps, if you have to ask that question, you're probably not ready for it right now. And like, what's your daily practice like? And you find out that they don't. So it's really figuring out what the training wheels are. And if you're going to start in a new system, even if you have experiences, is to, get on that ground floor. A lot of times people come to us very experienced and we'll be a little disgruntled that we'll start them back at our first degree, but it's a whole system. And if you go through that system, when you get to an upper degree, you're going to be mentoring somebody in a lower degree. So you might want to see what that process is like. And I've had some amazing priestesses, probably far more experienced than I, start in the temple, and be grateful that they started, early in the first degree and not skip out, because they learned so much of just kind of going back to the basics. I think the basics can always teach you stuff. And I think if you ever get to the point where you feel like you're not learning anything from reviewing the basics, you got a bigger problem. But I think a lot of people who are beginners mistake the knowledge of something with the experience of it. So they'll read a lot of different things. They might be better read than someone else and think that equates into experience, and they jump into something that might be difficult for them. So I think getting your training wheels, really being clear about, who you're joining, what you're joining. Is it something that is showing results that you want to emulate? And just digesting everything that you read. Don't read it once and then think, oh, I've mastered that. If it's an exercise that has practice to it, actually practice it a few times so you can say, what it feels like before you move on to something else.
Excellent advice. Now, I can't keep you too long today, and I have these required questions I must get to.
All right.
I own 2 of your books. The first book of yours I bought was Spirit Allies. The second book I bought was The Mighty Dead. I think you can catch a theme of my interest. A good portion of my audience are paranormal investigators, because I like to cater to both the paranormal and the occult crowd. But my absolute favorite discussions to get into are how occult practitioners, such as yourself, get involved in dealing with hauntings. Now, as the author of both Spirit Allies and The Mighty Dead, I'm going to wager that you have experienced at least one haunting in your life. Would that be fair?
Well, I've experienced a lot of contact, I would say. I get called to investigate a lot of hauntings. I would say out of the 20 plus years of doing this, out of the many phone calls I've gotten for hauntings, maybe 2 were really serious, or serious-esque. They weren't that bad. Most of them get chalked up to imprints and bad energy kind of replaying itself, but often I get called when people have problems and don't know what to do. A couple times they've been non-human things. They've been, elemental fairy kind of beings that were disgruntled. But yeah, I usually, for the longest time before the temple, my big form of service and vocation and work besides the classes and books was seeing individual clients and kind of paying house calls to people, whether it be for healing or whether it be for hauntings or, vigil for when someone was dying. So often I would get called out to do hauntings, and the vast majority of them turned out not to be. I think the one that turned out not to be, that was the first, was probably the most interesting for me, because I was expecting a full-on kind of spirit trapped type of thing. And it was a family that had a lot of abuse in the house. And it was the imprints of abuse kind of took on their own life when one of the kids started practicing magic and practicing occultism. And people experienced it as a manifestation and a haunting, but there was actually no intelligence or no spirit there. It was really the energy of the whole family being super messed up. So that was really interesting, because I'd never really thought about that possibility until being in that situation. And I'd helped to clear it, but I think the family was still pretty messed up, and I don't know how long-term effective it was, but I gave them my assessment, and I don't think they really wanted to hear it, but hopefully they were able to take steps for it.
Yeah. Now, how does spirit contact manifest itself to you?
Well, mostly my spirits are pretty polite. So most of my regular spirit contact happens in the context of either daily practice and ritual, or dream time and meditations. But in terms of the haunting aspect of it, usually what I do if I'm going into a situation, I'm not one of those super great, I have to admit, I'm not one of those super great psychics that kind of can go around the corner and feel things and start spouting things out. I'm a deep trance kind of guy. So, I'll check out the space. I'll kind of bring a pendulum around to see what's the most, active room if I can't feel it. But then I usually kind of center myself in the midst of whatever I'm feeling the activity is, and kind of invoke my own shields and my guardians, and then sink down into a deep trance. And usually ask my own familiar spirits and entities that I have a good rapport with to kind of be the intermediaries and the go-betweens, and for me to see through their eyes and for them to help me with their impressions of what's happening. And usually through that kind of intermediary process, I can get a good sense of what these unfamiliar or disgruntled spirits want and how they're working. So for me, it's kind of a cooperative team effort. I would be a terrible television psychic, because I think I'd be very boring. I'd, say he's down in a trance, he's closed his eyes. Okay, looks like he's asleep for a while, and he's come back with an answer. I don't think that makes really great television, but it's been effective for me.
Okay, and if somebody came to you and says, we've eliminated everything. we know it's not the cycles of abuse, although I'm really glad you bring that up, because that's an aspect of hauntings I don't think people pay enough attention to. But they've really boiled it down. They're convinced, and we'll just assume for the sake of the fun of it, they've really got an unruly spirit in the house. What would you do to help them, or tell them to help themselves?
Well, I think part of it also in the paradigm is helping the spirit. So if you can establish communication with the spirit, does the spirit first want help? And if the spirit wants help, what does it want? My general rule of thumb, which not everybody agrees with, but I'm okay with that, is if a spirit's not being harmful and isn't ready to leave and is not causing a problem, I'm actually a big believer in cohabitating, in different spaces. I think if an entity, is not causing harm, that's one thing. But I think if an entity is causing malice, causing sickness, causing damage, I get to try to have a conversation through my intermediary familiars and guides and say, Is this something, what do you want? Why are you doing this? How can we change the situation? And if they're not willing to enter into agreement or change their behavior, then I would forcibly kind of evict. And that forcible eviction, for me is really a healing. I don't think we can call it a banishment, we can call it an eviction, but I think it's trying to get them into an environment. What's bad energy? It's energy that's not in the appropriate environment. What's a bad spirit? It's that spirit that's not in the appropriate environment. So if it's there through trauma and violence or fear, whatever the sticking point might be of why the spirit hasn't moved on, how can we facilitate it to be in a more appropriate space? So usually I'll kind of open up a space or open up a gate with my allies' help. And I kind of envision it as almost the cosmic elevator, or a pillar of light that's like the axis mundi or the world tree, where I'd usually burn a candle and kind of open a space and set the parameters and ask my guides to help that spirit through and find its level of where it needs to be. Ideally, I try to get the spirit to cooperate. Sometimes you can't, and if it's malicious, but that's usually the process I go through. I think I've only really come across really stubborn, malicious spirits a couple times. It's not really my first go-to. I have other friends that do a little bit more ghost hunting, but the times I've had to do it, that's usually the process that I go through. And I've had quite a few experiences where the spirit eventually could kind of be coaxed into accepting help and wanting help, and it being a more cooperative process. If it's just an imprint, and it feels like a repetitive spirit, like the image of somebody constantly going up the stairs, or the image of somebody kind of popping out of the closet, but it's the same image over time and it doesn't really have a lot of intelligence to it, I'll just try to break down that pattern. And for me, I use a lot of herbal things for it. So burning particularly cleansing incenses. If something's really nasty, burning asafoetida. But generally I tend to do dragon's blood and frankincense. I'm a big fan of rue water and sprinkling the place with rue water, as long as nobody has any allergies to that. The typical iron and salt kind of witchy magical things if you need to kind of move it out from a particular space and kind of prevent it from going into another. Big fan of railroad spikes when needed.
Yeah, railroad spikes should be in everybody's toolbox.
Yeah.
If nothing else, they just generate really interesting conversation when people see them.
That's very true. I had a friend who had a cross made out of railroad spikes hanging on her wall, and when people who are non-magical would come over and be like, "That's an interesting cross," and she'd just be like, "Yes, isn't it?"
Yep. Sometimes it's better to leave them wondering.
Yeah.
Well, Christopher, I've really appreciated you giving me the time today to talk to you. We're coming near the end of the regular episode, but I wanted to check, is there something I should have asked or something you'd like to talk about that I didn't cover, or do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with everyone?
No, I think we covered most of the interesting, fun things. I mean, for me, just to share with people at the end, I think magic is something you do, and witchcraft is something you do. And, we can talk about the popularity in media and the aesthetics, and I think all of that can be very beautiful. But don't forget, while pursuing it on social media and observing people's aesthetics with it, or even participating in dressing up like a witch or wearing the jewelry, it's really something you do in the quiet moments. It's something you really become through doing. So don't forget to do it. Don't forget to practice your magic. And it doesn't have to be a spell all the time, but don't forget to kind of invoke the worldview and the eyes of the witch or a magician or druid or, priest, whatever you may see yourself as. But really experience it, live it, explore. That's where the true meaning of it comes from, whether you have the aesthetic of it or not.
Well said, my friend. Now tell people where they can find you, your books, your courses.
Well, right now my website is undergoing a major renovation, but generally it is ChristopherPenczak.com. And the temple work and community work we do is templeofwitchcraft.org. And I'm on all sorts of social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and the dreaded Facebook. And I'm pretty interactive with people there, and try to reach out as much as I can, when I can, and put little, pithy thoughts and share classes that are going on or share news about new books that are coming up. So those are all great ways. And I do have a mailing list through ChristopherPenczak.com, and the temple has a mailing list through templeofwitchcraft.org. So if you want to get things just to your inbox, those are good ways to do it too.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks. Now, for everyone out there, you know the drill. We're going to go head over to the bonus episode portion of this. And if you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. Thank you all again for tuning in. I hope you got everything you needed out of this episode. And please go check out Christopher's books, check out his site. I hit him up on social media. He's one great guy out there doing great work. Stay weird out there, my friends.
Okay, gang, that's a wrap on this episode of Weird Web Radio. Once again, thank you all for listening. Now, it's time for you to go join the official Weird Web Radio membership. Go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio and you can choose your rewards and become a member today. Enjoy all the exclusive benefits, inside information, and plenty of bonus audio with each guest. Now, you can find the show at weirdwebradio.com and weirdwebradio.libsyn.com. The show is listed on Facebook and Twitter as Weird Web Radio, and you can find me on Instagram as just Lonnie_Scott. Please remember to rate and comment and share the shows that you like, and it helps others find us in all the search results. Shoot me an email if you want to be a guest on the show, or if you know someone that would be a great guest in upcoming episodes. You can send that to weirdwebradio@gmail.com. Seek the mysteries and delights in life, my friends. As always, stay weird out there.